I was going to start with talking about the Alex Ross passage, just because I can play it in isolation and make a couple of comments about it, and about a parallel passage to it, at least one that I very strongly hear, although it's quite different. First thing, I should find where this is in those of you who have the libretto, I will tell you where it is. It is on page 147 of the libretto, the Fricka's line starting with Deine ewigen Gattin, your eternal spouses. But it's very important that you read the notes before, where we've heard Brunhilde off the stage. To understand this passage, it has to be taken in context. And I think that actually, so far we've talked about this passage, I think too much from one standpoint only, and I think there's very strongly another standpoint. Wotan, in a really rather heartbreaking, it seems to me, when he says, Ich rief sie für Sigmund zu Haus, sort of talking to her, but talking to himself, is that she's coming, he hears the jolly old Brunhilde, as we see her the very first time, is kind of this teenage cheerleader, very, very, very immature, superficial kind of character. And Wotan very kind of bitterly says, she's coming back because I called her to bring her horse to lead Sigmund to victory. And of course, he's just getting ready to give away this victory. The actual music itself is at the bottom of the page, is after Fricka says her speech, your eternal spouse's sacred honor, the speech which she gives to Wotan, but in a way also for the benefit of Brunhilde. The only thing that she says directly to Brunhilde, which unfortunately I see is not clear at all in this libretto, is at the very bottom of 147, or those of you looking. It just says Wotan, but after it says Fricka strides toward the back of the stage, there she meets Brunhilde and pauses for a moment before her. That's she speaking. It doesn't say so, but it is. That's Fricka speaking, yes. Herr Vater dein, lass ihn dir künden, wie das Los gekiest. Let me just play this little sequence. It's sad that the people who most ask me questions about it aren't here anymore, but that's what happens with getting the last lecture. Am I too close, or is there interference from that, perhaps? First thing, the first passage, the passage that she says starts with Deine ewigen Gattin. I'm going to stick to the German now because otherwise it'll be confusing, because the translation I have is different from the one that you'll have. As we've heard Brunhilde, and this is now the specific passage that 12 measures that Alex Ross is speaking about. Fricka leaves, and we hear the curse. And Wotan and Brunhilde are left alone. I'll just make a couple of comments and then maybe get some feedback. One thing that about a great deal of this passage does not sound like other parts of the Ring very much. Especially the first part, this little, that's why I included it. Fricka's Deine ewigen Gattinis. What does it sound? To me, it sounds like a Protestant hymn. With slightly more fancy harmony, but has a very sort of solemn hymn-like. But what it really sounds like, and a lot of this music sounds like, at least in small little snippets, it sounds like very old-fashioned music. It sounds like music which is outside the normal sound of the music in the Ring, and with little interventions which remind us it's in the Ring, and that sound, I think, very purposely archaic, sort of an archaic thing. And this, of course, is metaphorically rather clear. After all, in a way, Fricka is the vanguard for the old world, and she is, there is a sense, at least in part, this is the triumph of the old world, that she has had Wotan see the error of his ways, and Brunhilde, who, to her at least, maybe not to us, stands for this new world, this new wild, uncontrolled world, will be forced into line too, and it's a kind of a moment of triumph for Fricka. And indeed, the very final, after Wotan makes his oath, the Alex Ross statement. This is a little bit more complex, because I can't say it sounds archaic exactly. Now, it does suggest a lot of things. I mean, there's no real motif, but since it comes directly before this rhythmic at the beginning, it almost sort of suggests or hints at the Albrecht's curse music. Especially the context does that. If taken out of context, we perhaps wouldn't hear that. But because, and I'm going to play a passage later which sort of reinforces that, it somehow seems in the world. It also, one of the strange things that actually, believe it or not, my very least favorite Wagner commentator, but very rightfully talks about, is when Fricka first comes in on this scene, we have little intimation of Erida's music, and he points out, of course, for Jungian reasons, that Fricka, like Erida, stands for this feminine deity and has this kind of sense of the, on some level, the sense of this all-knowing knowledge of the Earth Mother. There is something to that, and we very much hear that at the end of her peroration, this sort of chorale. This phrase definitely seems to sort of suggest or intimate that, reinforcing this aspect. And Fricka, in some ways, does have things in common with Erida. One thing, besides the fact that she's a female goddess, she's also someone that at least we don't know that, well, this is one of my questions coming up, to what extent Wotan ever loved her is a little bit in question. But that she loved Wotan is not. And we also know, and I think it's very important, that Erida also has been tamed by Wotan, by falling in love with Wotan. Erida has clearly fallen also in love at some point with Wotan. He explicitly tells us that. And so they have that in common as well. They're both women, these primal female goddess figures who have been in love with Wotan, or who are still perhaps in love with Wotan. And I think that all the discussion, the fact that this passage sort of represents to Wotan an ending of his dream, the end of the beginning of the ending of his dream, the beginning of of his realization that his dream of the heroes of Valhalla and the safety and now Sigmund going off and doing his job for him is over, is dashed, and has this sort of sadness. But I personally feel that the primary person whose emotions are being described or being evoked in this passage is if not primary, at least equally Fricka herself. And I think Alex Ross actually does talk about that in the article, that this also represents the end of Fricka's Fricka knows now. Fricka's decision to come to Wotan and have it out over this is her Donnybrook. This is burning the final bridge. Any hope she has of ever rehabilitating her relationship with, a rapprochement with Wotan, going back to the good old days of happy married bliss, if there ever were such days, is now over. Making him give up his most beloved project, his most beloved son, etc., he's never going to forgive her for this, and she knows it. And so I think that as much as what we talked about before, as this represents a musical evocation of Wotan's sadness, I think it's much more so, actually, Fricka's. And musically, it makes much more sense. Because it sounds much more like Fricka music than Wotan music. This sort of old-fashioned, archaic solemnity, seems to, and even in this way, it's kind of an interesting example of the curse motive. We're going to hear the curse quite a lot. Not quite a lot, but in some very key places. The curse is always heard in key places. We never hear that motive, but it's not key. In this coming up scene, Wotan's monologue, in which clearly it's references to what Alberic's curse means to Wotan is haunting him and causing all of his aspirations and hopes to be doomed to failure. But I think that the curse here could just as well also be the doom of Fricka's relationship with Wotan. That the ambition, greed, all the things that Alberic describes, being haunted by the constant fear, never being satisfied, that he conjures up in his curse, have also doomed any hope that Fricka may have ever had of rehabilitating that relationship as well. So I think that that's another side. Is there any other comments anybody wants to make about this, the Alex Ross passage? Have we covered that now? Okay, I just wanted to play you.
One thing, that's another point where it doesn't appear again in the movie.
That's absolutely right.
Like Winterstrom is one of those.
Yeah, very short. And but so much of the scene, that her whole big Shana, the beautiful Shana that she sings, the little aria, is so much of this scene's music. And it's just, there are little bits of that, certainly appears, but not harmonized like that. It's always, this is with this kind of very conventional, actually, closing. And I find that there was a wonderful comment. I don't know if you ever remember, actually, a very good Fricka from a long time ago. Mignon Dunn, does any of you remember her? Mignon Dunn said that this passage, which is the last thing Fricka sings in the ring, she could almost never get out because she was always crying. And indeed, I have to visually textualize that I saw a performance where I was close enough, and she was crying very hard as she sang that passage. In reality, not stage tears. And the reason she says is because Fricka realizes with these words that it's all up. It's all up with her. That she's ostensibly making triumph. Herr Vater dein, lass ihn dir künden. In other words, it's her moment of triumph over Brunhilde, but it's talk about a Pyrrhic victory. It's really a Pyrrhic victory. Okay, now I'm just going to show you one little passage which is quite different, but which has some parallels. Wagner would never allow a passage to be entirely unique. Just as in her Shana, the presence of the little love cell, that four-note cell, which is in the melody, in the melodic line, as I pointed out day before yesterday. And it's basically that it's kind of inserted into it in a very piquant form, and that gives it a link to the outside music of the ring. Also gives it a link, by the way, just to give away something for next year, it gives it a link with another very important scene where Wotan is confronting the women of his past. The theme of the scene between Wotan and Erda in Act 3 of Siegfried, a theme which we don't hear outside that theme, is which is, again, a very heroic form now of this love of the same four-note cell. Which creates a very interesting scene between these relationships. Okay, so now let me just find the page number of this parallel. It's going to take me, I'm afraid. No, I just found it. Look at me, I'm lucky. Okay, page 186. The bottom of the page, after the words "somewhat freely." This is sort of we're getting to it. This is right, very close to where in the production we saw last night he removed his robe. We're not at the end. We're not at the climax where he's going to really give in. He has not given in to her yet, but she has made her spiel about that she followed love and how much he would have liked to have followed love, and but cannot, he says. It's just, da labte süß dich selige Lust. Found it? Everybody happy? Okay. So let me play. I'm going to play from a little bit before. Curse mode, of course. Same key, by the way, is the example. And this is all in the same key as the example before. Sorts of mix up a little bit. It's really this now we're at the fate. It's that opening part, which again doesn't sound like music from the Ring. Right? This. It really, it's not the same music as what she's saying. But there's something very harmonically and sound-wise. The fact that this time it grows out of the curse motive in the same key, whereas the other one grows into the curse motive in the same key. I think it's kind of a reflection, the one of the reflection of the other. He's also saying basically very specifically, saying kind of goodbye to a dream. It's sort of it's the end of a period. It's just a reflection. And what it is too is, I think that it was very, very unlike Wagner to have anything not in some way at least mirrored or evoked or he needs to have, it would be like in Beethoven, the same kind of thing. It would be very highly unusual to have an episode in any mature Beethoven work, whether it be a symphony or a string quartet or whatever, that is not mirrored or related to some other material in the work. To have just a completely different episode. Schubert does that all the time, but Beethoven doesn't. I mean, they have very different ideas about musical form. And the Ring would be very unlikely. So I think that Wagner, to my ears at least, this is not the kind of thing I can scientifically prove to you, but I feel that this is kind of a parallel passage to the one that Fricka says goodbye, that Alex Ross talks about. It's so much so that actually when I read the Alex Ross article originally, in my mind I said, oh, well, don't we do hear that again with Wotan? But we don't. It's not the same music, but there's something about it, the way it sounds and the way it sort of stops the action on there's a harmonic reason too, but that makes me feel, and it's just another example of how Wagner is very intent upon creating these parallels, which also I think a director could make something out of it as well. I'm glad the directors are making a little bit more out of Wotan's relationship with Fricka and presumably with Erda as well. Okay, let's go back. I wanted one more little tiny thing before we get to the questions, which has to do with productions. One little note about many of the productions, unfortunately, of the more interesting productions, the productions like in Enschede and I forgot the name of the person, but that looked extremely interesting, but also many of these German smaller theaters, these are done for reduced Wagner. This is, Wagner, for economic reasons, didn't do it himself, but he permitted, what's the word we use legally, a version, there's a legal term for that, which is licensed, thank you, licensed a reduced Ring version for a very normal sized orchestra, no Wagner tubas, 4 horns, no bass trumpet, 1 harp, very normal sized orchestra, and which is to this day what is done in smaller theaters. And most of these Rings, not Frankfurt, not Hamburg, not the biggies, not Dresden, are done in these reduced things. Now, that's not entirely necessarily to say that it's entirely bad. I saw, in some ways, a very satisfying Rheingold and a very satisfying, believe it or not, Elektra done in Augsburg with reduced orchestra. But let's not kid ourselves. It's a radically different experience. Just as I feel like there's a lot to be gained by playing it on the piano, but let's not kid ourselves. That's not like hearing a Wagner's orchestra. Well, neither is this. Eliminating Wagner tubas, just as a start, is really quite a major thing. Wagner uses orchestral color as a very important element in the Ring, and it's very much part of our whole image. And so to go and spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars and make a trip to Europe to see a Ring that has no Wagner tubas, no bass trumpet, basically a Brahms symphony orchestra, which is what it basically is, I think one should at least know the choice one's making before one makes the choice. Let's just put it. There's something wonderful about that. It's sort of that Wagner could be for everybody. You don't have to go. And at the time, I think the idea, Wagner was very clever. He wanted, of course, to promote Bayreuth, or at least Cosima wanted him to promote Bayreuth. So the idea was, but he realized that if his works were not done anywhere else, there'd be no publicity. Why would people go to Bayreuth? So the idea was saying, well, you can see it here in your local opera house in sort of a cut down, reduced version. But if you want the real thing, to get the taste for it, but to get the real thing, you have to go to Bayreuth. Because initially, I think only Bayreuth, and then I guess Munich, were doing it with the real Ring orchestra. Because for one thing, and I wondered about this last night with Amsterdam too, I know that theater, and I don't think the pit's big enough for Wagner's orchestra. And so maybe they did the reconfiguration very simply because that was what they didn't have all the harps, but in Rheingold that's not, in Walküre that's totally not important. That was the only way they could fit the whole orchestra in. The 98% of normal opera pits can in no way fit Wagner's Ring orchestra. The other Wagner operas, they can. By the way, just a little misconception. I hear this all the time. I read this in the New York Times, of all places, and you think, God, don't they know better? They'll complain, they'll say, how can City Opera do Meistersinger with its huge orchestral forces? And Meistersinger has the same size orchestra as Fidelio. Exactly. The only difference, it has glockenspiel and a harp, and Fidelio doesn't. But that doesn't take up too much space in the set. In other words, not all of Wagner operas have big orchestras, but the Ring really does. The orchestra in the Ring is 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 16, 17, 18, 19, is minimally 20 people bigger than the next biggest orchestra he wrote for, which would be Parsifal. So that's a lot of people. And and also instruments take up room too. So, and there's the other factors too, is that if you have 8 horns instead of 4, and 4 trombones instead of 3, and an extra tuba, and then 4 Wagner tubas, you need more string players, and winds and 4s instead of winds and 2s to balance it. And so you can do, God knows, wouldn't want to hear. Lohengrin was originally done in Weimar. Weimar is another one that has a tiny pit. That would be a radically reduced orchestra there, probably even more reduced than the licensed one. Poor Liszt did the world premiere, but the theater's the same, of Lohengrin with 6 first violins and 4 seconds. And so there's 10 violins total. The beginning of Lohengrin, I don't know if you can remember, the prelude to Lohengrin starts with the violins divided into 12 altogether. So you wonder how they did it. There's literally more parts than there are violinists. So it's going to cost. But of course, the point is that they triumphed presumably over the limitations they had and managed to do with a very small orchestra. And it can be done. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. I would much rather hear or see a Wagner performance done with enthusiasm and fire and commitment and real sense of passion and purpose, with very, very inadequate forces and perhaps semi-professional singers and things like that, than one which is done with highly professional, adequate forces and the whole thing, but done very much as a routine, uninterested, and uncommitted sort of standard performance. I think most of us feel. But I do think it's worthwhile that you know that. So before you buy your ticket and pay to go see the Ring in Enschede or in Weimar, you should know that you're seeing the reduced Ring. You're seeing a different Ring, which, not necessarily cut. I don't know if anybody cuts the Ring anymore. I haven't heard the last cut performance of the Ring. Now, Tristan is still almost always cut. But the last cut performance of the Ring I saw personally was when the Met finished the Karajan Ring. How many of you saw I call it the Karajan Ring because the first 2 were done by Karajan. It was the Met's Ring before the Otto Schenk Ring. The one done, the sort of very sort of neo-Bayreuth sets. And there was a cut in that Ring. There were, of course, the traditional cuts that were done in the Ring in the 20s and 30s and 40s and before. Does anybody know where?
The Virginia Opera a few years ago did Die Walküre without Wotan's monologue.
Okay, right. And Wotan's monologue, by the way, there's somebody I talked to last night, I think would have been very happy to hear the Ring without Wotan's monologue. Yeah, but I think it just wasn't done very well. The Wotan's monologue just needs to be done great. And also, we were really being penalized, I think. Sometimes, I mean, DVD is the best we can do, but you need the theater sometimes to have the whole set. Wotan's monologue is totally crucial to the Ring from all standpoints, both from what is being said, from who's saying it, why he's saying it, to whom he's saying it, but also from a musical standpoint, it's sort of the nexus, the darkest, lowest point in the whole structure. But we have to understand that the cuts were universal at one time. But the cut that they used to do at the Met was really quite interesting. It was the only. Did anybody know where it was? In which one it was and where? No, that's a famous one. I'll get to that in a second. That was at Bayreuth. That's the only cut ever done in the history of the Bayreuth Theater, sanctioned by Karl Böhm, no less. This was in Siegfried, Act 3 of Siegfried, and it was after the Wotan Erde scene, when Siegfried comes on stage following his bird, and the bird is scared away, and he has the scene with Wotan, and then he has a confrontation with Wotan, breaks the spear, and goes to the fire. Now, this is, let's say, one of the crucial moments in the entire Ring. After all, the spear has broken the sword in the second act of Walküre, and now in the third act of Siegfried, the sword will come back and break the spear. It's the end of Wotan's, the last shred of his reign and power, etc., etc. It's a really very, as a matter of fact, I think if you did the Ring as a tragedy in a more normal way than we tend to do it today, this would be the end of the rising action. Well, if Siegfried is the tragic hero of the Ring and not Wotan, the climax in terms of the tragic arc would be Siegfried's breaking the spear and going to the fire. The high point of the, anyway. I mean, that would be one sort of partial view of the whole Ring. And the reason, but the most interesting thing about it was why he cut it. There's this, it's only 4 or 5 minutes in a work. Siegfried is 4 hours and 10 minutes of music. And the Ring is about 15 hours of music, so it represents a very small amount of savings. And there are two primary reasons why cuts are made traditionally. One of them is hard to countenance, I think, and the other is very understandable. The one is, of course, to shorten the performance, to make the performance over earlier. The great master, if you want to call him that, of that was Artur Bodansky, the main conductor at the Met in the 1930s. His performances are unique in their cuts. He literally cuts to smithereens. Artur Bodansky had a very simple principle. Every performance would start at 8, and the musicians would be out before midnight. It didn't matter what they were doing, he would manage it. And Bodansky said that he would do so without ever cutting any complete scenes. So every scene of every work was done. And he specialized, he loved to find ways to cut 8 measures here, and 8 measures there, and 16 measures here, because he could find ways that he could do harmonic, some kind of vaguely continuity so that it wouldn't sound entirely ridiculous. And there's very little of Bodansky's work available for us because it was almost all at the Met in a period where the Met will not allow, they won't sanction the sale of DVDs from this period. Not because of the cuts, probably, because the orchestra wants to get a cut and they can't. But they're published in Europe. We have, for instance, in some ways, one of the greatest Meistersingers, but to me the most entirely unlistenable to, with Bodansky conducted with Friedrich Schor and Elizabeth Schumann, and I mean just an unbelievably great cast. Emanuel Liszt, Janssen, I mean just an unbelievable cast of Meistersinger. And I think it's fair to say, Bells, that like there's never 3 phrases in a row where not one of them is cut. So you never have a chance to settle down and listen to anything. Even the prize song, everything is cut. The quintet is not cut, but just before and just after is. And I don't mean big cuts. I mean 4 measures here and 8 measures there. I mean it's like you can never. It's like unlistenable to. That was Bodansky's approach. The more usual approach, for instance, there's that very famous recording of Götterdämmerung with Flagstad from the Norwegian radio, which was her conditio sine qua non for her agreeing to participate in the Schulte Ring, the John Kulschall Schulte Ring, the first studio ring recording. And her presence to us today, just singing Fricka, seems like a very small thing. But I think to the opera world of 1956-57, the presence of Kirsten Flagstad was a guarantor of success. I mean, she was still this extremely unique, iconic figure among Wagnerian. And she was the music director at this time of the Norwegian opera, and she wanted a recording of Götterdämmerung of the Norwegian opera. And they had the tapes all done and ready to go. It was just the way records are made today. Nobody can afford to make records anymore, so you pay for your own. This is true of the Berlin Philharmonic now. The Berlin Philharmonic used to, Deutsche Grammophon would pay for the hall, pay the musicians, pay the technicians, pay the union scale, and then they would do the record and they would put it together. That doesn't happen anymore. Nobody can afford to do that. I mean, Yo-Yo Ma and the Silk Road Project or the Three Tenors can do that, but nothing else can. So the Berlin Philharmonic makes their own records and then brings it to Deutsche Grammophon, and they package it, sell it, and promote it. That's the only way economically records can be made anymore. The age of recorded studio recordings is over in classical music, at least over for now, on that level anyway. So anyway, the package that was given as a completely normal thing to Kulshaw, it didn't have any tiny cuts. There were no Norns. There was no Alberich. The orchestral interludes in Act 1 were all eliminated except for the Rhine Journey. There's one other major character which is eliminated, but they just eliminated whole characters, you know. And I guess you could imagine, it's kind of hard to imagine the beginning of Götterdämmerung without the Norns, but you know, it saves a lot of money. You save, you know, save. But the reason for the reason for that is to make it shorter, or for economic reasons. There is another reason for cuts in Wagner, and this was the primary reason for cuts in Siegfried, cuts in Tristan to this day, and it cuts in Siegfried also probably still to this day. Siegfried would still be likely the one Wagner opera cut a lot, and that of course is because of the problems of the singers. The roles are so difficult that you cut the roles, make the roll shorter to spare the singer's voice. In Siegfried, what happens usually is they cut, the forging song is after all, has stanzas. Even though the way the accompaniment is done varies each time, it's still basically the same music. And he's not saying anything that furthers the plot. He's just singing a song. So they cut, there's 3 stanzas of each, there's 2 parts to the forging song, and 3 stanzas in each part. So they just cut 1 stanza of each part, and it makes it less tiring, less difficult, less overwhelming for Siegfried to sing the role. But the role that is most frequent, and still today almost always cut, is Tristan. A big gaping hole is cut in the love duet, and a huge hole sometimes is cut in the 3rd act, and that's just simply to save. Nobody pretends that this is cut because otherwise it would be boring, or cut because it would be too long, or cut because the music isn't good. It's just cut because am I still mic'd? Okay, a cut because Tristan couldn't get through the role. Just on a personal note, I had never gone to a performance of Tristan, and actually there were other reasons, but one of my sort of official reason was because I didn't want to hear Tristan cut. It would be like having a gaping wound in my body. And Levine made, when they revived Tristan for the first time at the Met, which I think was in 83 or 84, Levine made a big deal about the fact that he had opened the cuts, and that it would be done complete, as it had not been done since Toscanini. Whereas the Ring was always done at the Met and uncut, parts of all uncut at festival performances at the end of the season. They may have cut it during the season, but even Bodansky did festival uncut performances of these pieces. This would be the first Tristan uncut. And so I bought my ticket and went, and then they got to the 2nd act and they cut 165 or 206, an enormous amount of the love duet is cut. And I was really outraged. It actually wrote Maestro Levine a letter expressing my outrage in no uncertain terms. And believe it or not, he answered me on the same day by messenger. I'm sure I've told this story before. And he said that unfortunately here there was a conflict between James Levine, conductor of the performance of Tristan and Isolde, and James Levine, the music director of the Metropolitan Opera. And he says, as conductor of the performance, he would have canceled the performance. Because Manfred Jung, the Tristan, the day of the performance said, either we do the cut or I don't sing. And he said that we had really no replacement, and so as music director of the Met, necessity won out. And there was a very interesting afterword to this. We went to Bayreuth in 1996 and 1998 because we were good friends with one of the singers in the cast, and we had dinner with her, and this was James Levine's conducting. The Rosalie, I guess, Ring, and which I actually liked quite a lot. And the singer was saying there's something very strange. What's his name? Manfred Jung, who's the Siegfried, whom I always did not like very much, is on the Chirot. He wasn't singing Siegfried in the Chirot that I heard it, but he's on the Chirot CD that you have. Was the Tristan at New York, and was the Mima at this much later ring in Bayreuth. And she said, it's very strange. Maestro Levine will not speak to Manfred Jung. He obviously just won't speak to him. And I said, well, I know why. And then you may well say, well, then why was he in the cast if he was conducting? Manfred Jung was always a great favorite of Wolfgang Wagner, a great personal favorite of Wolfgang Wagner. And so I'm sure that Levine had no choice in it. He was forced upon him, but his punishment was he wouldn't speak to him. But the cut was done at the Met. The cut in the Siegfried was done at the Met because when Siegfried first comes on stage, he says to Wotan, what a strange hat you're wearing. And Karajan, who had also designed the costumes, did not have Wotan wearing a hat. And so he thought it would be too ludicrous to have Siegfried say, what a strange hat you're wearing without having a hat. And so he cut the scene, which I think is showing his priorities exactly in the right place. Interestingly enough, there was a funny afterwards of this too, is that when Kubelik conducted the Götterdämmerung the next year with Nielsen, the cut was open, which means they didn't do the cut. They played the scene. How they solved the problem was Wotan walked off stage and came back on wearing the hat from the 1936 production, this big old-fashioned hat. So he had a hat for the scene. So that was solved. But you raised your hand about the cut, the Gutrune. The only cut in the history of Bayreuth since the beginning of the festival, as far as I know, was done in 1966, 7, and 8, I think. And that was the Wieland Wagner ring, and then they changed. There was such an outcry, and he cut, and Böhm agreed to do it. After the funeral music, after the Trauermusik, when Gudrun's alone, and she's having this horrible sort of, it's kind of claustrophobic and nightmarish, and she says, where's Brunhilde? And she's gone. Was that the woman I saw go to the Rhine? Is that his horn? And she's this fraught with a huge amount of anxiety. And into the middle of this, Hagen comes running in, with his lights and bearing, and then the men come bearing Siegfried, and the action moves on. It's just 2 minutes and 46 seconds long. And I think it's really it's a real coup de théâtre, an extremely theatrical scene, especially coming in the context of all this. And it brings things back into a more intimate mode from the grandeur and mythic sort of death of Siegfried and the funeral march to the very personal Gutrune. But he cut it, and it was cut. And they agreed to do it. I mean, for 3 years it was cut at Bayreuth. So who knows? 2 minutes and 46 seconds. The only person singing is Gutrune, whose voice you hardly need to protect. He didn't like it, I guess. That's all. Or he didn't know what to do with staging it, or whatever. Okay, let's go into my questions. You guys all have these questions? You've read them. You're ready to answer them. All right. And I have to confess that a lot of them I've already answered, or at least indirectly answered in the course of my talks. And so that means I expect you people to answer them immediately, fully, brilliantly, and profoundly. Okay, question number 1. When do we first hear that Siegmund is an unconscious agent for Wotan? I put unconscious in quotation marks since in parentheses, sorry, because he probably doesn't know it. So when do we first hear it?
When he was talking about his father was there, and they went to the woods, and then had the wolf skin.
Yeah, but he doesn't know that's Wotan. We do. Oh, I see. Okay, we hear, that's right. Okay, I would say we certainly know then. When we hear, he says, I looked for my father, and then we hear, I came and the wolf skin was empty, and we hear, stops even there. And for me, in my mind, it stops a lot because in the old Schulte LPs, that was the end of the side 1. And so, yes, okay. So that is unquestionably a place where we know that Siegmund is related. Yeah?
Well, when Hunding listened to his story about being a wolfling and such, it says that he recognizes the story.
Yes, that's right. Well, when he says that he recognizes the story, we have no reason to assume that was Wotan. I mean, because he's talking about, I know an evil race, and what they love is what nobody else does, and they're hated by everybody and by me. That's true. However, what about the place, though, where Hunding says, very early on in the scene, long before he started telling his story. I always have trouble finding this spot. So early, that's the reason. Can't be before that. Yes, it can. Right at the very beginning of the scene, when she's just said, did you tend to him? He says, yes, I looked after him, and then it says, okay. Just going with the stage directions. Hunding looks keenly and with surprise at Siegmund's features, which he compares with Sieglinde's. So I'll play the whole passage. And Hunding says how he's like her. The serpent's deceit glistens too in his glance, as we hear. Which, after all, is the spear motive. It's only played by a solo bass clarinet pianissimo, so it's lost its impetus. It's kind of mysterious and secret, but certainly it's telling us one of the very important roles of the orchestra and of leitmotifs. This, which I think I did talk about last year in the Rheingold things, is what are the functions of the music in the ring. And one of the functions of the music in the ring is a kind of Greek chorus. It's telling us things that the people on stage don't necessarily know. Yeah?
Yeah, actually, then you could say that we actually know from the very beginning.
That's what I would say.
From the prelude, because actually the thunder recalls the end of Das Rheingold. So you already know that he's involved in something that relates to...
As far as I'm concerned, we even know before that. We know from this scale, this Wotan spear going up and down. We know from... when he first walks on stage, and he's already seems burdened with Wotan's spear, with the legacy. We don't know specifically anything yet, although maybe we do at this place. And we certainly only your answer about Valhalla is correct. I mean, that's when we really know. But in a way, we should at least peripherally or subliminally know even from the very start. Because ostensibly the first act of Walküre is in a world outside of the world of a complete break from the world of Rheingold. We don't hear any of the ring motive. We don't hear of Alberic's curse. We don't hear any of that kind of stuff. It's all absent on purpose. But we do have this presence from the past in those forms. Yeah?
If I remember correctly, in the video we saw yesterday, Sigmund was preceded on the stage by a figure.
That was Wotan, yeah.
Wotan.
Mm-hmm. That's fairly commonly done now. Yeah, I don't think it's necessary. I mean, I think it's not wrong, but it sort of assumes that the audience is going to notice. But yeah.
You've also pointed out that when Sieglinde offers him the water, you hear the theme.
That's more subtle, but yes, you're right. That you hear it in a very tender, beautiful thing. But that accompaniment is not part of the love music. It's not the love cell or recognizable love music. It's actually just a very beautiful, tender sort of extension, free improvisation on basically the spear music. That's true. That's very subtle. Very, again, if at all, we know that very subliminally. But now you all know it. See, so now your ears will be open to it all. Anything else on this question before we go on to the next one? Okay, the question 2. This is why I like this question. This was something in the light of the production yesterday, too. Does Siegmund recognize Sieglinde before she officially recognizes him as her brother? Now, first thing, let's get very clear. The place where she officially recognizes him is right before the end of the act. Just to find it for you, in your librettos, it's page 138, the very last thing that Sieglinde says. Sieglinde beside herself. When she finally says, "And you called your father Wolf. Was that really his name?" And he says, "No. My father's name was Velsa." And he says, "If your father is Velsa, then I know who you are. You're Siegmund." And he says, "Yes, I'm Siegmund." Okay, so this is the official place, right before the end. This is right before he pulls the sword out of the tree, that she officially recognizes him. Now, my question is, do we think, or do we know, or do we imagine that he has already recognized her for who she is, or perhaps she has recognized him for who she is? Yes, I think so too.
Long shot when she gives him the water.
Right at the very beginning, then.
They look at each other. You hear the love theme, and there's certainly recognition. Something.
Yeah, that is an argument. something happens there, certainly. I mean, it's the beginning if they begin to fall in love there, that's for sure. And we hear that very vividly in the music. But there is something, perhaps, yes. But the only problem with an answer like that, Lynn, is that it cannot be either confirmed or denied, because it's just that would be basically like saying that because they're twins and because they have this shared past, even though it's way back in their lives when they were still very small, it's still, for instance, when Sieglinde is having her nightmare right before the final battle when Siegmund is killed, she's dreaming about when they were children and she's alone with her mother and she says, Daddy and my brother are gone and I don't like the way these men are looking at us and this and that and the other. So she's already thinking about it. So there is some memory bank in there. So maybe that is an element. We can't really know that, yeah?
Do you think Wagner cared about when Sieglinde recognized Siegmund?
Yes. I put it this way. Whether on this level, no. No, I don't. I mean, in other words, whether they're falling in love with each other because they recognize each other as something from each other's past, or whether they fall in love, I think more commonly because they are bound both by this. They're both people who have the possibility and need the ability of great compassion, and they see each other's suffering, they see each other's need, and they respond to that almost instinctively. I think that's far more important than knowing where exactly this moment happens. My only question it has less to, and that's the reason why I feel like an answer like that is you can't. It could be, but who knows? There's no way to say anything. It does make a difference. Only this. This is the entire scene in Act 1. Yes, they fall in love, but it definitely is heading in a certain direction. It's heading in a direction towards Siegmund pulling out the sword. It's heading in a direction for her leaving her husband and running off with him. And if this all happens spontaneously and it's somewhat different than if it happens because it's being pushed in that direction. I feel personally, and I'll tell you where it is, we actually talked about this years ago, but everybody's forgotten, that I actually think that Siegmund has recognized Sieglinde, or thinks he has, and is making sure of the identification, and also perhaps because he feels, there's a very, very practical concern. If I had a long-lost twin sister, and I came back and found her, and I said, geez, that's my long-lost twin sister, and I'm falling in love with her, and I want desperately to have sex with her, I think I might be a little hesitant about saying, let's go screw, because I might say, she's saying, but you're my brother, horrors. So he wants the whole thing to kind of unfold naturally. And then she's already saying, oh boy, let's go screw. He says, but you're my brother, but she's already too hot to care, if you get my drift. So you understand what I'm saying? I think that's very different.
My point really is, do we read too much into these characters, which are not real people? They're just creations of Wagner. Mm-hmm. And we read too much into Wagner's mind by presuming that all of these subtleties and these relationships and these thoughts really can take place.
Well, I guess the answer to that question is whether we want, I don't want to trivialize your question. I think that's a serious question. And I think that certainly can be true. I have conversations, I'm a lover of Tolkien, and I have some of my Wagner friends are also Tolkien lovers, and they will get involved in these very sort of deep philosophical questions about Tolkien characters, when I would agree with you that it's kind of beside the point, because they're just basically personages that fulfill roles into this big story, which he is doing. I actually think that in the case of Wagner and The Ring, that the characters, the story, the drama, the interrelationships are a lot more significant than just storybook characters. It would never dream for me to worry about the ramifications of characters in even though this is a very great composer, a Verdi opera, in the same way I would in The Ring. There are differences. First thing, Wagner, as you said, he wrote the story. I mean, yes, he took it from mythology, but he made up the story, and he wrote the music, and he wrote the screenplay, and he was extremely concerned. I mean, it's not called screen. What's it called for the theater? But he was very, very concerned. One of Wagner's biggest concerns, the overwhelming reason for his development of the kind of music he wrote, and the kind of operas, the reason that The Ring is not one opera but four, is that he wanted to flesh out his characters. He wanted to give his characters, and this is Wagner's words, not mine, he wanted to give them motivation, purpose, that everything they do, every act they make, every motion they make is somehow very understandable within their background as a person. And so he gives them both musical and physical backgrounds. He wrote Siegfried and then Walküre and then Rheingold precisely because he found that having just the story being told in Götterdämmerung and just having people pull out their swords and spears and whatever and making oaths and doing things like that was meaningless, was trivial, was just opera. And he wanted it to be more than that. So I think we are justified to some extent. You can go too far. Absolutely. And do I think this is a crucial issue or an important question or something? No, of course I don't. Of course I don't. And if you feel it's a waste of your time, you probably should leave. I think that there is some validity to it. But for instance, it can be kind of fun to tell certain kinds of questions. And I sometimes have questions like this, maybe I do even here, in The Ring, which are just silly. For instance, the questions like, what direction is Siegfried coming to the Gibbetschung's palace on the Rhine? Is he going north or south? Or are there any characters in The Ring who are explicitly left-handed? Or these are Stefan Mikisch has a very long list of questions, all of which are like this, and they're very amusing, but they're absolutely, of course, totally without substance or meaning. It's just a game. Those can be fun too. And Tolkien is full of those. My God, millions of the questions. Who is the only character whose mother is older than his father, or something like this, silly things like that. I do think, to give you credit for the seriousness of your question, that it's very easy to get bogged down in things in The Ring and to miss the forest for the trees. And if these questions do that, then I'm very sorry. And there is something to this question. Just to cut myself short, so we can leave this one and go into something else. I actually think that it's a very good point could be made that Siegmund has recognized Sieglinde as his sister, but does not know how to go forward in the relationship. And I think actually it does make a difference. It colors the way they're acting in Act 2 as well, when he wants to go on and she is being racked with terrible sense of guilt. Not the guilt that the Victorians saw, or not the guilt that some idiotic book that Ari had back there. One of these books, one that's meant to be idiotic. What it basically says that she's guilty because she's a tainted woman and she's feeling horrified because of her adultery and incest. And of course that's exactly the opposite. She's feeling horrified because she was married and she's not pure to give herself to her brother, who she feels is her true spiritual husband. But still, the fact is that and those books are fun. I mean, don't get me wrong, but they're just I'd buy it too. I just wouldn't want to take it too seriously. Yeah.
Two questions.
Actually, let me finish this and then I'll get to the question. I'm just in the middle of saying what I was saying, but to me, the reason that I feel that there is some substance to this because I think that it adds depth to the character of Siegmund. Specifically Siegmund, not just Sigmund Sieglinde, whom we always think of as this group. Sieglinde will rise to great tragic heights in Act 3. I think Simon made a very good, a very important point about how Sieglinde, whom we see a little bit as just this kind of repressed and then very sort of teary woman in Act 3 in her great peroration to Brunhilde, when she realizes she's pregnant, she has kind of a cause in her life, I think rises to tragic heights. Siegmund, of course, is someone who the greatest tragic thing he does, the greatest thing he does is really his inspiration of Brunhilde. His in complete unconditional faithfulness and love to Sieglinde, and then when he finds out that Sieglinde's their unborn child, is such that he inspires Brunhilde, and Brunhilde's actions have enormous ramifications. But I think that there could be make a point that Siegmund is a more calculating figure than we usually think of him. And I feel that maybe it's just chance, and maybe it's just Wagner certainly being his Rousseauian and showing that the real love, the kind of love that he wants, is something which is growing out of nature. He's already done that. The love motive is a direct part of Fricka's music in its most basic form originally. That that kind of love is something which is very tied to nature. Nevertheless, it does seem just a little bit strong that the whole Wintersturme is talking about spring embracing his bride love. That love and spring are husband and wife, and they break, but they're brother and sister. The sister embraces his brother. Spring. I mean, it just seems a little bit. I don't know. Maybe it's just totally chance. But to me, it always has felt like that Sigmund is sort of setting the table, seeing how she responds, and so she responds in the way he hopes she does, and not with, "Oh my God, you're my brother. Jesus, don't touch me," which would have been a very understandable response.
I actually remember when you were talking about this
10 years ago. 10 years ago.
And you explained it in terms of it was just a simple dare versus D thing. You can view it as a brother, sister, male, female. It's just a thing of English language. One is winter, one is a dare and one is a D. And we're not supposed to give it any attribution more than just...
I fear that you might be confusing two different of my talks. Because here it's not a dare D thing. I mean, there are plenty of dare D things when you do. I mean, it's like saying, you can't say that houses in German are neutral because it's das Haus. I mean, it's just not fair. Although there could be something to be said the fact that the word for kitchen is feminine, perhaps. But when he says, love has lured spring here. Deep in, this is on page 135, deep in our breasts love lay hidden. In bliss she now laughs in the light. The sister bride was freed by her brother. In ruins lies what held them asunder. Exulting the couple greet one another, united or love and spring. Making this point of love and spring being brother and sister, and now they're united in love. Of course, it's poetically very perfect, and it suits Wagner's sort of Rousseauian view of love as the sort of natural love. But it just makes me wonder whether Sigmund perhaps has some purpose. Yeah?
Two silly questions. The first is, in historical note, wasn't Wagner taken up with his younger sister?
Could you speak louder, please? We can't hear you.
Okay, I'll repeat the question. That's the easiest.
Do this. Let me start again. Wasn't Wagner infatuated with his sister's clothes? I think that somewhere in some book that we were talking about, he was fascinated with women's clothes. He wore silk things on it. And does that have any connection with any relationship to this, where you got the idea about it?
Okay, the question is, we know that, there's two parts to your question, and they're separate, actually. There's two biographical facts about Wagner, which might tie into this. One is that Wagner had a real adoration of his older sister. Some would say almost incestuous, although it certainly was never realized, because she certainly was never aware of it. But I forgot her, Adelie, was that her name anyway? Older sister who was like 12 or 14 years older than he was, who was an extremely important figure in his early life. And then the other part was that Wagner liked to wear women's clothes. And late in his life had people procure women's clothes for him. Whether or not he actually was a cross-dresser in the sense that we think of that is probably not true, because it was all done very sort of intimately and privately and stuff, but still. Now I'm going to play the role of I'm sorry, I forgot your name, but play the role. I feel these are issues that not only profoundly don't interest me, especially the women's clothes, but which I feel are actually profoundly dangerous, because those are the kind of questions that really can cause us to confuse the forest for the trees. Not because of the psychosexuality involved in women's clothes. I could care less as far as that goes. But because this is something I've wrestled a lot with, very specifically just now. The big piece I'm playing in Washington on the 21st is the Schubert B-flat Sonata, which is the very last piece Schubert wrote. And I always talk about the pieces I'm playing in my concerts, and it's very traditional in cases of understanding this work, and indeed all three of the last sonatas. These are written by someone who would be dead in 5 or 6 weeks. And to what extent one should read, understand, interpret, experience this work as the work of someone who is literally looking into the grave, who's aware of his own death or looking beyond the grave, to what extent this is an issue. And I thought of 3 parallels about this. And the answer, I'm sorry I'm far afield, but this is dealing with it sort of in a more in a more important way about the issue of to what extent we should try to understand artists' work by biographical data of their lives. And I feel that we put enormously too much emphasis on. For instance, I'm not really interested in what kind of clothes Wagner wore. I'm interested in what books he read, what paintings he liked, who his friends were and what they thought. I feel like those are important, but those don't seem to interest people. People want to know about what he did in bed. That's what interests people, finally. But going back to a much more interesting thing about the idea of death. Okay, I'm going to give, if you don't mind, I'm sorry, this is nothing about Wagner, but this does relate to this. 3 very famous examples of pieces. I'm going to start with perhaps the most famous of all, the Tchaikovsky Pathetique Symphony. Now, this is what I learned when I was a kid, that Tchaikovsky was terribly depressed, terribly sad, terribly melancholic. He wrote the Pathetique Symphony right before he died, and then still in this incredible gloom, this total transcendental abyss of blackness, he, in the middle of a cholera epidemic, purposely drank infected water and died horribly of cholera. Okay, that's the official line. So the Pathetique Symphony is an expression of his own just absolutely overwhelming depression, which led to a particularly hideous suicide. Okay. Then there was a revisionist, a very typical 1990s revanchist view of the whole thing, which is that that yes, the Pathetique Symphony was an expression of his abysmal suicidal gloom, but actually the fact was that he was having an affair with a 15-year-old boy who was the son of a Grand Duke, who discovered the affair and said that either he would kill himself or that he would be sent to Siberia for the rest of his life, and that actually that he didn't die of cholera at all, that this was all just a cover-up, that he actually took poison, died quickly and easily, but he was totally suicidal, and this thing was just a big historical cover-up to cover up Tchaikovsky's homosexuality. And this was the revanchiste thing, which I also believed a little bit. I wasn't never convinced, but this is what I was told. Okay, now here are, as far as I can say, facts, as best we can tell. Yes, he was having an affair with the 15-year-old son of the Grand Duke. The Grand Duke was also homosexual, as was Tchaikovsky's brother, as was pretty much everybody at this school. This was in an almost completely homosexual world, and no one was threatening anybody with exposure. They were all part of it. There was no exposure involved to it. So that's completely a canard. It just sounded good. It fulfilled a political thing, a very understandable, very even laudable political thing, but had no basis on the facts here. Fact is, this is the fact, that Tchaikovsky wrote one other piece at the same time as the Pathetique Symphony, actually even slightly later. Anybody know what it is? It's a terribly sad, suicidal piece, just black, the most depressive black piece. Yes, right. Which one? Which one? Nutcracker. That's right. Now, that's really a dark piece, isn't it? That's really a sad, dark piece, isn't it? Boy, we can really see the guy on the verge of suicide with that piece, can't we? And I'd also like to point out that the Pathetique Symphony was the most successful piece that Tchaikovsky ever had. That it was an extraordinary success. He was riding an absolute tidal wave of success. And that all the testimony is that he had never been in a better humor. Never been in a better humor. I would just posit the fact that Tchaikovsky was also famously careless. All of his friends were always talking about his terrible carelessness, and that he died of cholera not for some unbelievable, wonderful sort of biographical despair, existential blackness, but because he was careless and drank unboiled water, got sick, and died at age 53 at the height of his career. It's horrible. We would love to think there's some kind of great reason behind these things, but sometimes there isn't. And yes, you can read, anybody who could write the Pathetique Symphony is someone who understands blackness and wants to manifest it, describe it, evoke it in his works. You could not write the Pathetique Symphony if you didn't have that in your personality. But to try to read that into his daily life and said, he wrote this piece, therefore he was going to commit suicide, that's a terribly dangerous trap. Okay, let's take another case. Beethoven's late string quartets. Some of the greatest, most visionary, most strange, most unique, most difficult music ever written that seems to inhabit a universe all of its own, and that weren't even actually part of the repertoire for 80 years or so. Only great composers like Wagner appreciated it. It was 131, the most difficult of the bunch, was Wagner's favorite. But they were never played. I mean, Wagner would have never heard it in a public performance. But the idea was that Beethoven knew he was dying, and this is music he's writing from beyond the grave. This is a view of the after. This is the works that only can be reached by people who have gotten to the point of death and see beyond death into the eternal. But the fact is that until Beethoven got pneumonia and then his whole health collapsed, he got sick while he was writing Opus 132, and it describes his illness and his recovery. But Beethoven was in perfectly good health and had no clue that he was going to die. There's no indication whatsoever that Beethoven died. He had thousands of pieces, projects he was working on. There's absolutely no indication whatsoever that the late quartets are in any way pieces written by somebody who knew he was going to die. A more even exceptional case, one where I really fell into the trap along with everybody else, is Gustav Mahler. All of us, all traditional Mahler exegetes until just the last 4 or 5 years have interpreted Das Lied von der Erde, the Ninth Symphony, and the unfinished 10th Symphony as the works of someone who knew he was dying. And the farewell works to the world, and he has achieved this sort of visionary view of someone who has not just 1 foot, but 3 feet and 4 arms and 7 fingers in the grave, and is really giving us a view from beyond. The fact is that Mahler had this heart condition and was told he needed to take care of himself. He was also told that he could probably live 25 or 30 years if he did. And he had plans for many, many years. He was in a terrible mood the last year of his life because his wife was betraying him in the most unbelievably egregious manner. And he was very upset by it. He had the famous meeting with Freud and all this stuff. And she was having sex with her lover, Kokoschka, on the couch in his dressing room during the world premiere of the 8th Symphony in Munich, for instance. I think most of us would be upset by that. He was also obsessed with death because his daughter had just died. And he was having a great deal of difficulty getting over that. And he was kept on weighing on it. Well, I think most of us would do that too. If a 5-year-old daughter died of scarlet fever. And he was obsessed with the sense of endings and new beginnings because he had left Vienna, which had been the goal of his life, to be the head of the Staatsoper. And the period of Vienna was over, and he'd embarked on a new life in America, which he embarked on with enormous enthusiasm and had great plans. There's a huge amount of myth about Mahler's stay in America, which was politically done in order to make Mahler the symbol of Europeans' hold on America as opposed to real Americans on America, which only started with Toscanini. The idea with Toscanini was the one who really brought music at a high point to American music, and that's Balderdash. That's this total revisionist history. And so, once again, it is incorrect to find, even in cases like this, and of course, when composers die shortly after, and Mahler's own contemporaries, this fantastic letter of Alban Berg, the Ninth Symphony of Mahler was performed after his death. And Alban Berg writes a letter about the Ninth Symphony, and he describes the whole thing as Mahler's vision of his own death, and you can see death coming in, and then he arrives beyond it, and all this. And it's extremely poetic and very beautiful. It's also entirely fallacious. But because he's conditioned by the fact that he indeed did die. He died. But Mahler didn't know he was going to die. Now, in the case of Schubert, it is somewhat different because Schubert did know he was dying. Very clearly knew he was dying. Schubert was only 31 years old, too, so there's an extra sort of condition in there. Anyway, to go back to Wagner, I just think it's exceptionally dangerous to try to understand, interpret, read works of artists, especially artists like Wagner, by parts of the details of their life. That is not to say that biographical things aren't important. The relationship with Matilda von Wesendonck. I did have a question about that from the other day, but I want to get my facts, and I'd rather do that in private than in public anyway. I just wonder when he actually met Matilda von Wesendonck. Had he met Matilda von Wesendonck when he started the composition of Die Walküre? Okay. I thought it was 55. But you could easily be right, and I could be wrong. That's why I'm not doing it in public. I don't want to be wrong. Anyway, nevertheless, I know he wrote "List That I'm in Love." That's true, and that was it. But I don't know if that was her or not. It doesn't matter. I just think that even in the case of Matilda von Wesendonck, who had a big impression on Wagner, I think it's actually probably more useful to say that she existed because he needed her, for Tristan in particular, than vice versa. I'm just very, very reluctant to try to read. And the big picture, what they read, who they were, what interested them, what Schopenhauer and Feuerbach and all that, that's all very, very important. But the more the details in life, even the exile did have, but Wagner always wrote his better music when he wasn't in Germany. There's only one Wagner opera. If we eliminate the first three, the Apprentice operas, there's only one Wagner opera written actually entirely in Germany. What? Lohengrin.
That's the first three.
No, I meant by the first three. I meant Fane and yeah, and Lohengrin. I think we all agree sort of suffers from kind of a four-square quality, which might explain. Yes, excuse me.
We think you're wrong about Mahler. At least what I've read is that his endocarditis was diagnosed in New York, and he was told that he was.
Yes, on March the 2nd, 1911.
Yeah, and so he went back to Vienna.
Yes,
to die.
that's correct.
He was aware that he was going
Sure, absolutely. From March the 2nd, 1911 until his death 2 months later.
Plus, he said he thought he was going to live 20, 25 years.
When he wrote the Das Lied von der Erde and the Ninth Symphony, yes. He wrote no music after he was told he was going to die. Right. He was told he had a heart condition in 1906. But there was a heart condition. They said that if he took care of himself, he could take care of it. And until in February of Mahler is someone whose life I know pretty well. In February of 1911, he was busy conducting thousands of things, and he started getting a sore throat and feeling very weak. He went to the doctor. The doctor did a test, and it was just completely shattering. But he knew he was going to die. That's right. Sorry. Okay. Excuse me. We're supposed to be talking about Wagner. That's right. Let's stick to Wagner. Okay. Question number 3. How do we know that Fricka once loved Wotan? Is there any indication that the feeling was mutual?
Well, he lost his eye for her.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, for God's sake.
So that's a good. Okay, that's a good answer. Did everybody hear that? He paid an eye to marry her. He gave up one of his eyes to marry her. So, no, he actually. Now, there's different myths in that. He probably he gave up an eye to drink from the world ashtray, and he only has 2 eyes. But he staked his other eye. In other words, he said, that was like his stake. I'll be completely blind if I don't marry you. There's all sorts of mythological. But yes, that's just a fact that he did care. Now, that's not necessarily proof of love, is it? It could be. If we're talking about political marriage, that could be people gave up big things. But I think we can assume. I also think it's harder to find it in the music, but in Rheingold, the music that Fricka is given in Rheingold, and that we first hear Wotan sing, talking about Fricka. And then it becomes associated with Fricka very strongly in Rheingold. Can anybody tell me where we hear that tune outside of Rheingold? Siegfried arrives at the top. Thank you. And then later, harmonies he would have not heard in Rheingold. This is very the same music. Now, of course, this is not about Fricka at all anymore. It's maybe it was never really about Fricka specifically, but it's about women certainly. I mean, he doesn't even know it's a woman when he comes up there, and he's entranced by the whole scene, and there's this figure lying there, and it's very entranced. Does this? Well, we've talked about this before. Maybe I'll just leave that alone for now. But this particular melody, that's first associated with Fricka very strongly, is one of the most important melodic elements in the Ring. It also, just one element of it, without getting into the most important, is heard in a mirror in this. Piano. It's that leap, that's very unusual, that leap of a seventh going down. What's associated with Brunhilde and Götterdämmerung. The source of this melody is completely something else entirely, but the way it's done is, I think, the turn. The turn is still present. There's another very important melody in the Ring that has a turn and a leap of a seventh going down as well. What about? I mean, that's pretty. Anyway, we talk about that later. But yes, I think that's actually where this is all heading. So yes, it could very well be. I don't know why I took this here. It could very well be that all this are signs that Wotan did once love Fricka, and I think it's very clear that Fricka loved Wotan. I mean, and I think the reason for this question, the answer had to do with in her Shena, the fact that he is incorporated the love motive, the basic all-purpose sort of love motive in the Ring, is part of her song. is very clear evidence that she really does love or did love Wotan. And her sadness, we discussed it at the Alex Ross little fragment. Her sense of sadness at the end of it all, I think, are all sort of elements that she really did love Wotan. And as far as that he loved her, I guess we can presume it. And I also had thought about he was willing to pay for with his eye for it. Anybody else have any comments on the Fricka Wotan love? Okay, question 4. Now, the question 4 is the first of a series of questions. I talked the other day about the fact that Walküre is remarkable in that there has a series of these scenes of confrontations, which are not common in the ring, actually, where one person tries to convince someone else to do something, to change, and ends up succeeding in their changing their minds. And the 3 confrontations in Walküre are first Fricka and Wotan. Wotan knows what she's going to say. He says, "I'm going to stand pat. I have to come up with this storm, and I'm going to win." And he doesn't. She convinces him to change his mind. In other words, not to defend Siegmund, but to destroy him. And then the second confrontation, of course, is Brunhilde and Siegmund in the Death's Annunciation scene. Brunhilde goes in there with the firm intent to tell him that he's going to die, and he convinces her, no, that he should live. And then the third is Wotan and Brunhilde at the end of the opera, when Wotan is determined, or at least seems to be, that he is going to just leave her there on the mountain, punish her, have nothing to do with her, and go away. But she very eloquently defends herself and ends up convincing him to at least put this fire around her. And what the fire represents is that only Siegfried, the symbol of freedom, the symbol of the future, the symbol of the hope of redemption for the whole storyline, as far as both of them are concerned, will be her future, not some grim future at the hearth, spinning and being made fun of by everybody, which is what he says at one point. Pretty horrible stuff. Yeah, that's early, though. That's before. That's his original intent. So let's now sticking to question number 4, to Fricka with Wotan. Anybody have an idea of, is there a specific place where Fricka wins? In other words, where Fricka, or at least begins to win. I don't know if we where Wotan realizes that she is right, and then he is going to have to turn his back on Siegmund.
She says, but you gave him the sword.
Aha, I think that's right. It's the sword. That's exactly right. It's the sword that's the real clincher. And that's very important, because the symbolism of the sword. And what is the sword symbolism? What is the sword's motif? It's the motif of Wotan's great idea. In other words, that motif, which is originally the great idea, that gets right to the heart of it. In other words, he is not the realization of your great idea. That you are fooling yourself that he was, but that he is not. And that's the whole edifice crumbles. Crumbles remarkably quickly, actually, because she really gets to the nerve of it. And by the way, that's immediately after she says that we hear for the first time this new motive. And I think that motive is the motive of the Wotan knows that his plans have crumbled. They're not going to work. Okay, very good. Question 5. Most of us, that's special pleading. Many of us feel that of the Valkyries, only Brunhilde is Erida's child by Wotan. We don't know who the mother is of the others in this case.
But he keeps talking about sisters.
Oh yeah, but people talk about sisters when they're half sisters too. Really? How many people do you go around saying, "Oh, my half sister this," or "my half"? Most of us say "my sister." Okay, but I didn't say all of us. I said most of us. I personally am absolutely convinced that that the only Valkyrie born of Erda is Brunhilde. So on what grounds do I think that? Well, I'm asking you.
No, you said, do you think that?
Well, I will. I just want to get you guys to say something first.
But we don't think that.
Well, you don't think that. Does anybody else? Does no one else agree with me? Am I the only one in this room who thinks that only Brunhilde is? Okay, let's have a show. Excuse me. Let's do this. Let's do this right. I want to do this right. Would everyone who believes that only Brunhilde is the daughter of Erda raise their hand? Would those of you who think that all the Valkyries are the daughter of Erda raise their hand? Okay. Well, right. Yeah, that's a reasonable. Those of you who have no idea or no feelings about the subject, raise their hand. Okay. So we have a mixed crowd, but the largest group are those who agree with me, as it happens. So those of you who agree with me, tell me why. This is the middle of Wotan's monologue, right? And then he goes on, with 8 sisters I brought you up. And most of us would use that as our thing, that he says that the word, he's talking about that he tamed Erda with love, and that he came down because he needed to find out all this information. And from Erda, he gained information, but he also gained, as a pledge from the world's most wise woman, you, Brunhilde. And the way he says that, I mean, if all the Valkyries were that, they would hardly have the specialness of this moment. This is there's a very beautiful musical interlude there before he goes on with your 8 sisters. That there's in the text it follows immediately, but in the music there's one of these very tender moments, and I think that's very significant. I mean, I think there's a very strong special bond. And besides which, too, I mean, this doesn't have to be just because she's the daughter of Erda, but it's very crystal clear throughout the Walküre scene at the beginning of Act 3, that Brunhilde is his special child, that she has a relationship with him unlike anybody else. And this is also true, and I think this is even the clincher, and it's not within Walküre, it's in Siegfried. What does Erda say when the Wanderer, whom she knows as Wotan by this point, or doesn't know yet, actually, has not recognized him yet, says, she says, listen, if you need information, ask my daughter, Brunhilde. She doesn't say, if you need information, ask the Valkyries. She says, if you need information, if you need to know what's going on in the world, ask my daughter. She has all my wisdom, Brunhilde. And then he says, I put her to sleep, and that's what actually provokes the end of that scene. Just as mentioning the sword is what provokes, if there's a turning point, that's not a confrontation scene in the same kind of way at all, but there is a very big turning point in that scene. When Erda recognizes him and basically says, I won't have anything more to do with you, I'm going back to sleep, and that's that. And he says, good, because I don't have anything more to do with you either. That's sort of how that scene goes. But at that point, the point is when she finds out that he's put Brunhilde to sleep. He says, my wisdom is in this woman, is in my daughter. Go to her. And I mean, all of these things to me scream for the very specialness of Brunhilde and the very specialness. Erda, again, Erda doesn't say, go ask the. Besides which, we're given no indication of wisdom on the part of the Valkyries. There is a certain amount of wisdom, I think, shown by Waltraute in Götterdämmerung, but it's a very practical wisdom. I mean, she just cares about their father, and father says, if only Brunhilde would give the ring back to the Rhine maidens, and the world would be freed of the curse, and I would be freed, both the world and the god would be freed of the curse. And so she runs away and tells her that, and give up the. I don't think she has this great transcendental wisdom, but Brunhilde does. At least Erda certainly thinks so, and I think that Wotan thinks so too. So I think there's every indication. It's too bad that I'm not giving this argument to the person who most was convinced it wasn't true. I guess that's, oh well, that's too bad. Anyway, maybe you can convince her. She's come back now.
I think she is the only daughter, but spoken like the second born in my family, parents have a special relationship to their firstborn.
Sure.
So, that could reflect some of it too.
Sure. But yeah, right. Well, okay. But yeah, sure. But but think, maybe I could buy what Wotan says, but it's even in that light what Erda says.
My mother liked my brother.
Okay, well, I'm also the second born. Yeah. Excuse me. Yes. Shh. No idea. I don't know. The mythology, I don't think, talks about it, but I don't know. In the mythology, there's some indication almost as if the Valkyries are sired by Wotan alone. I mean, just as Pallas Athena sprang forth from Zeus's head without a mother. But there's so many different versions of these stories. I'm sure in some version but I've never heard that there's any version. As a matter of fact, I don't know this because I'm not an expert by any means on Germanic or Norse mythologies. But I would be willing to bet at pretty good odds that in no Norse mythology or Germanic mythology is Erda the mother with Wotan of the Valkyries. I think he makes this because he needs this, and he needs it to explain the very specialist, but also to explain Brunhilde's wisdom. And Erda's response in Siegfried when she says, if you need to know things, go to my child, Brunhilde. So that's the big part of my argument.
Okay, then I'll take that.
Okay, good.
That's evidence.
Okay.
Footnote comment, the Washington Society of New York has this pamphlet. I'm sure you have seen it with the family tree of all the people. And there it appears that all the Mercurians are daughters
And that particular family tree has more misinformation than any other single piece of paper that I've ever seen. It is. I hope that the person who did it is not present, but that is really a weak.
It's worth correcting.
Yes, I know. My problem was I started to correct, and the person I was doing it to was Natalie Wagner, and Natalie Wagner does not like to be corrected. And since we usually all of us have to be one of the highest necessities. Talking about höchste Not. One of the höchste Not for all of us is to please our employers, and she's a potential employer of mine, so I don't want to make her too angry with me. We need to move on to more questions. But is this about this question, or is this? Yes.
Middle of page 143. Not to say that Fricka is an authority on who her husband is sleeping with.
Mm-hmm.
He makes reference to those unmarried girls who were born of the bond of the dissolute love.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering how you.
Go on with that same quote, though. Go on. Yes. Mit den schlimmen Mädchen, die wilde Männer bunt dir gebar, denn dein Weib noch scheutest du so, dass der Walküren Schar und Brünnhilden selbst. She separates Brünnhilde. All these Brünnhildes, and even Brünnhilde. So even she separates Brünnhilde. She doesn't want him sleeping with anybody but herself, even Erda. It's kind of strange that he would call having a love affair with Erda. One of the things, by the way, I've always found disingenuous about her shocked abhorrence of adultery is that she's Wotan's sister. In all the myths, Fricka is Wotan's sister. So I guess incest is okay with gods. Yes?
One of the amusing things is the non-expert Anna Russell thinks all the Valkyries are the daughter of Wotan.
That's correct. Absolutely. There's an authority. I like Anna Russell. Okay, let's go on. Question number 6. This is a more substantial question and one that we really won't have time to go into now. Wotan undergoes a wide range of emotional states in the course of his monologue. What are they and when do they occur? Now, I just like to point out one thing. I think one of the reasons why Wotan's monologue, not the only reason, one of the reasons why Wotan's monologue is often boring, and people feel like this is like the weakest part of the ring. And as I heard last night, the reason why people hate Wagner, and I take that's a serious. I'm not belittling that by any means. It's because it isn't well done, and they don't. If it's done just as somebody, muttering, and that's kind of what he's doing at the beginning, is muttering, the facts of his life, and it's stuff that we know anyway, which is not true, but still, a lot of it is not stuff we know. I think it becomes terribly static. It risks becoming static. And I think one of the things, there are a lot of things that a stage director, that a performer, the onus of blame in this is not the stage director, but rather, I think, a combination of the Wotan, who was, I think, limited, the conductor, who was, I think, very brilliant in some places, but didn't quite get all the possibilities in that scene, and maybe also just the filming, the staging, not having, having that very boring view of his face from one attitude, not having any sense of, and indeed, Wotan's monologue was very brilliantly done, staged by Chiraud. When he's at that desk and there's that world globe, and at the climax place of Das Ende, he takes the world globe and throws it to the ground. And I mean, he definitely, certainly, I just answered part of my question. One of the big turning points in the scene is when he gets to that big climax and he says, Das Ende, and then für das Ende sorgt Albrecht, and he goes into a new thing. He goes basically from kind of depressed horror to outraged and bitter irony. There's a distinct change of mood there. Let me find that exactly. Okay, it's page 153 near the bottom, and it says he pauses in thought. He says, farewell. And as a matter of fact, the real change actually occurs before. See the little stage direction? Wotan's demeanor passes from an expression of the most terrible anguish to one of desperation. That's a real turning point. And then he says, Das Ende, and it goes into a new thing. And I think the big change, these are fancy words that Wagner's using, but the big change is that from this point on, Wotan has channeled all of his frustration, all of his despair, all of his disappointment, all of his feeling of helplessness into anger. What defines Wotan from this moment, really until the end of Act 3, when Brünnhilde makes him see his better self again, is that everything about him has been channeled into just anger. That's why someone asked yesterday, why does he bother killing Hunding? Why does he wave his hand contemptuously and Hunding drops dead? He doesn't need to kill Hunding. There's nothing to be gained by killing Hunding, because he's just so damned angry. He has to have outlets. I mean, the whole scene with Brünnhilde and the Walküres, he's just beside himself with anger. And he's angry because that's the only thing that he can do. What he really is in despair. What he really is terribly unhappy, terribly trapped, terribly disappointed, terribly angry with himself, if nothing else. So he outlets it on everybody else. And this is a big turning point in the scene, where he goes from reflection and self-awareness. And actually, I think there's a very important point here, too, which is that he goes from a state of heightened self-awareness to blindness. The angry man is blind, or the angry woman is blind, because their ability to appreciate, to see, to pity, to understand, to make value judgments is completely blinded by their anger. So before the scene, the things that he says are, I think, very revelatory, and later too they're revelatory, but sort of against his will. Now, we can't take seriously what he's saying because he's blinded by his anger. There are other places. I really think that a deep and careful study of Wotan's monologue and getting to know the music, the very subtle things in it, would appreciate all of our understanding of that scene. Anybody else have a comment on Wotan's monologue, or can I go on? Okay, so let's go on to question 7. And we're going back to the confrontations. So we agreed that the turning point in the confrontation scene between Wotan and Fricka is when Fricka mentions the sword that he gave, and that's when Wotan realizes that it's all up. Okay, so where does Brunhilde change her mind? What happens in that scene that causes Brunhilde to change her mind? Where does it happen? No?
He says, I'm not going.
Well, yes, you're right. And then there's this long silence, and she says, let's find the page. I could play this on the piano, but I'm afraid we don't have time. Okay. This actually happens quite a lot later than that. He says, I won't go. He says, I won't go on the top of page 161. And then she keeps getting more and more vehement, saying, no, you have to go. You've seen me. Only people who've seen me are doomed to go.
When he says he'll kill Sigmund.
That's right. That's the truth. That's the real turning point. I think that this one is not one that happens all at once. I think that she is really shaken by the fact that he's not interested in going to Valhalla. And he says, really to give up eternal bliss for this woman, this tired, sad little woman. It's a beautiful, pathetic line. By the way, the music of that line, I won't go into that, but what time is it? I don't have my watch here. Way past. That music forecasts the music of the sleeping Brunhilde, which is kind of interesting. But nevertheless, I think that the real place where the real turning point takes place is when he realizes that Brunhilde, that his wife, that Sieglinde is pregnant, and he'll kill both her and the baby. And so it could even be argued that, yes, she's motivated by tremendous compassion, but she's also, in a way, motivated, at least maybe subliminally. She's going to, after all, Brunhilde is the great hero who's going to, if there's any redemption in the ring, she's the instrument of it ultimately. And if that baby's killed, then there is none. I mean, that's very important. So she also kind of leaps into action there, too, in a way. I don't want to take away from, I think she's motivated by compassion, by tremendous compassion. But there's also, I think, some of that, too. So the turning point, yes, is when he refuses to go. But the real turning point is when he learns that she's pregnant, and he says, "Oh, okay, I'll kill them both." Okay. The 8 and 9 go together. One is during the course of Wotan is sort of gradually calming down after the Walküres leave, and getting more and more. He's still sort of angry, but he's sort of calming down. But he breaks into a rage at one moment. What makes Wotan break out in this rage in the final scene with Brunhilde is one place when he does get quite angry. I was going to play it, but I'm not going to. Anybody can tell me where that is and why it happens? It's when she starts talking about the Velsungs. And then she says, I saved the sword. It's the sword again. Just as the sword was the point when Wotan gives up on his plan with Sigmund, when she says, I've saved the sword, and the pieces of the sword she's got with him, that's when he really shuts her up. Because the sword is still the bearer, is still the symbolic embodiment of Wotan's great idea. He has not really given up on his great idea. And as long as those fragments of the sword, but he doesn't want to blow it this time. He wants to make sure that there's distance, that he's not involved. As we'll find out in Siegfried, he's not really entirely uninvolved, but he certainly doesn't want to be actively involved anymore. So he says, don't talk to me about that sword. And there's this long silence. He interrupts the music and there's this long silence. Okay, but that's not the real turning point. The real turning point in the Brunhilde confrontation comes later. And that one, unlike the one in the scene with Brunhilde, I think really does happen all at once. Yes, she's been breaking him down, but he really turns all at once. And actually, one who writes very beautifully about this scene is Derek Cook. The very last part of his book, before he died, talks about this. So what is it that Brunhilde finally says that pushes the right button? And he just is melted. What is it?
When the free hero will come through the fire.
Well, part of your answer, part of what you said is part of what you say is right. Part of what you said is the correct answer, I think, Lynn, but not the whole thing. Yeah.
When she urges him not to let her be shamed.
Well, but it's ironic. If that were just the case, he's made a big point of that she's going to be shamed, that she's going to be the ridicule of everybody who sees her. Yeah. That's later. He says that himself. Yes, but he's already convinced then.
I did what you wanted.
Well, yes, but that's what she's been saying all along. And then first he says, "I told you to do the other." And then he has a very bitter outcry when he says, "Sure, that's because you follow the path of love. I have to follow this quote unquote higher path, and we're separate because of that." So he uses that as a weapon against her initially. No, there's one thing she says that melts everything.
She asked him to kill her.
That's true. It comes right after that. Right after that. She does ask to kill him. She says, "Don't shame me, kill me. Take your sword and kill me. Take your spear and kill me." What? She mentions Loga. She mentions the fire. She says, "Put the fire around me." It's when she says the fire that everything changes. And it's unbelievable. That's one of the greatest places in the Ring, the music. The first instance with the magic fire. When she says, we first hear the music, the magic fire music, which is a combination of Loga and the Walküre underneath. I will play that. It's very fast. You know, that's it. Which becomes the bearer of a tremendous amount of all the later heroism in the Ring. The later heroism in the Ring is revolved around that. We don't think of Loga and fire as being sort of a heroic element in the Ring, but it becomes that. All of Siegfried's most heroic stuff, truly heroic stuff, is revolved around that. Going through the fire and then going back to the fire, and then even indeed at the very end, actually.
So why is it that he's moved by the fire?
Well, that's a good question. Who is Loga and what is Loga? First thing, it's not just a fire, it's Loga. It's the magic fire. Maybe because it stands for transformation. Maybe because it stands for rebirth. Maybe because on some level, read Derek Cook on this subject actually. On some level, Wotan remembers who Loga is, what he did with Loga, and what Loga, what it all means. From a Schopenhauerian standpoint, because of course Loga is the instrument of Wotan's own death.
Initially, actually, he got him out of a dilemma. He had dug himself a hole.
That's also true. He, in a way, allows him to have his cake and eat it too. That's true. Yeah.
Because this sets before him the possibility of, in essence, prearranging future unions with Siegfried.
That's
therefore advancing possibly.
Exactly. I don't know if Wotan is quite as calculating as all that, but your answer is absolutely right. It does do that. That's what you said too, basically. Cake and eat it too. In other words, what does Die Walküre end with? It certainly ends with this extremely enchanted and magical sense of terribly sad farewell and terribly sense of loss, but it also ends with a tremendous sense of promise for the future. When he says, "Only he who does not fear my spear will come through this fire," he sings it to this very pregnant music, which we know is Siegfried's motive. Don't forget that Wagner assumes us not just to remember everything we've heard before, but he assumes us that we're going to understand what it means in the future. And also, there's a parallelism. What does Rheingold end with? It ends with Wotan's great idea. The very last music in Rheingold, before the last little tiny coda, is a recapitulation of the sword motive, which is actually Wotan's great idea. It ends with a promise of Walküre. And what does Walküre end with? It ends with Wotan announcing, "Only he who doesn't fear my spear," which means he will break my spear, will go through this fire. And that's Siegfried. He sings it to the Siegfried motive. We haven't seen Siegfried yet. We haven't seen the sword yet. Which is the embodiment of Wotan's great idea. But it sort of sets up the next thing. So it's also just very clever theatrics. It sort of says, and the next installment, you have to have that little teaser, as it were. But the symbolism of what fire in Loga means to Wotan and in the ring is a very rich subject, and one that we really can't do justice to in 90 seconds. But you should read Derek Cook on that. He's actually very good on that. But I do think that is exactly what Brunhilde needed to say. Wotan wants to do this anyway, of course. Why has he spent so much time there? Why hasn't he just said, all right, bye, put you to sleep, leave her? The fact that he's stayed and talked with her as long as he has is because, of course, he doesn't really want to do it. He doesn't want to say goodbye at all. But he certainly doesn't really want to shame her. He doesn't really want to kill her. He doesn't really want to leave her, But she says what he needs to hear for his opposition to melt. Okay, let's finish. Okay, when he calls, we talked yesterday about there's very few places in the ring where Wotan uses his spear, actually uses it. It's not just a symbol of something. And even though he didn't in this production, he has in every, that's one thing I have to say, every production I've ever seen. That's kind of a very important spot where Wotan uses a spear, and we hear it physically in the orchestra 3 times when he knocks it on the ground to conjure up Loga to come and turn himself into the fire. It's very important that we understand this is not just fire. That's why the fact that it be fire or not be fire doesn't seem to be very important. It needs to be magic. Something very, very, something very important, significant. And is there another place in the ring that parallels this use of the spear to conjure up fire? I think I even said it the other day. Götterdämmerung where? When Brunhilde, who is she talking to? Okay, let's find it. Ravens, thank you. That's right. She's saying she's calling the ravens, and what's she telling the ravens to do? To go to Loga. To go to Wotan and tell her that the end is nigh, but on your way, stop by Loga and tell him the time has come. Right, and so in other words, it's set. Okay, I want to just touch 1 second on the extra credit question that we talked a lot about before. And this is the old question that starts Derek Cook's book out. It's the single most controversial moment in the ring, which is why just before Sigmund pulls this sword out of the tree, we hear